Welcome to Petroleum Follies 2, Deja Vu all over again. I'm Michael Lynch, your humble narrator. This is the second in a series of lectures about some of the misunderstandings, misconceptions, and mistakes that have occurred in oil economics, oil markets, and especially the interpretations of them that are so common. This particular lecture will focus on the comparison between the 1970s and the recent oil price super spike, shall we say, and how so many things have been repeated, often without people realizing it. This is drawn in large part from my book, published last year. As I mentioned in the previous lecture, it is very deep and analytical, but it also includes quotes from Faust, Gilgamesh, and Bullwinkle J. Moose, probably the only book on the market today that has those three distinguished philosophers cited. Prophets and profits. Oh, so many people bemoan relying on forecasters and economists and pundits. There is a way to deal with it, first developed by Roman Emperor Hadrian. He received a prophecy from the sacred fountain Castalian, and afterwards he had it bricked up so no one else could get a similar prophecy. I think a lot of CEOs and decision makers wish they could do the same with their tame economists. One thing you hear again and again is, when will prices recover? They're below $60 and the industry can't survive with that. Numerous governments relying on oil revenue are struggling. Everyone's waiting to see when the price recovers to $100, $110, or at least $80. This is not new. Back in 1982, when the price had dropped slightly, despite many predictions that it would continue going up after the huge increase we saw in 79, 80, people started referring to that price, nearly $100, as being a low price and describing all the problems that resulted from it. Now, I'm sure all of you have read the 18th Brumaire of Louis Napoleon by Karl Marx, here on our left. The only thing I remember from that is his comment that Hegel believed that history repeated itself, but forgot to say that the first time was tragedy and the second time farce. I guess I would say that I believe the first time, the 70s, was tragedy and the last decade was the farce. Here's the tragedy. People were convinced in the late 70s, early 80s, that the price of oil would go up forever. The model I worked on, the IPE model, you may have heard about new types of biodiesel aside from French fry oil or palm oil. One thing that was promoted heavily in recent years is jatropha beans. This is a plant that grows in arid regions, originated in South Asia, and people said it could be a source of fuel. The funny thing is, back in the 70s, people said the same thing about the jojoba bean, which grew in arid climates, specifically in Mexico, was promoted as a source of biodiesel, but ultimately turned out to be used primarily in cosmetics, a use that has a much better value added. And then there's resource nationalism. You have so many people pointing to things like Hugo Chavez, seen here with Fidel Castro, who took some pretty strong moves against the oil industry that resulted in Venezuelan oil production declining. This is just one of many examples we've seen in the last decade that people point to as policies that prevent companies from investing and developing new supplies overseas. That arguably is one reason why people think the easy oil is gone. And we have the analogy in the 70s where we see, again, our old pal, the late Fidel Castro, with Pierre Trudeau, then Canadian Prime Minister. His policy was focused on getting rid of imperialist, antagonistic foreign oil companies, i.e. American, Yes, we're the bad guys, even in Canada. And he created a national oil company and took steps to try to keep the oil and gas in the ground for future generations. Of course, after he left office, the government then reversed those policies and promoted rapid expansion of exports, especially natural gas, but at much lower prices than Trudeau would have received. And in terms of peak oil, one example is extremely illuminating, if not entertaining. James Schlesinger, former Secretary of Defense, former CIA head, the first U.S. Secretary of Energy under the Carter years. He helped found the department, and a PhD economist. About a decade ago, at a peak oil conference, he announced that the issue had been settled, that the peak had arrived, and there was no longer any debate. Needless to say, the audience was thrilled. And obviously, with those credentials, who could question him? Well, me. In 1979, Jim Schlesinger said essentially the same thing, that oil production was unlikely to ever rise above its current levels, which were then 65 million barrels a day, now over 90. And frankly, he's not really an energy expert. He held a number of posts in the government, but his focus was usually on national security issues, and especially the Soviet Union. He has done no serious research in the energy field. One thing people keep commenting on is the fact that you need to replace declining production. This is a quote from environmentalist Joe Rahm. We need an equivalent of Saudi Arabia's production every 2 years to replace declines. I've heard that before. Jimmy Carter said, just to stay even, we need the production of a new Texas every year, an Alaskan North Slope every 9 months, or a new Saudi Arabia every 3 years. Obviously, this cannot continue. That was 1977, the year I began my research. And let's face it, when he said this cannot continue, he's been wrong for 39 years, and there's no reason to believe the situation has changed. And then we have the argument that we need to reduce our dependence on oil imports, especially from countries in the Middle East, even though we don't, in fact, import very much oil from there. But you have such luminaries as James Woolsey, former head of the Central Intelligence Agency, and a noted conservative thinker, remarking that we need to lower demand and utilize substitutes as cheaply and quickly as possible. I think pretty much everybody is aware that this is nothing new. In fact, Winston Churchill was worried about it more than a century ago for his country, England, and its navy, which was then switching from coal to oil. But let's face it, here's President Nixon, former president, the late president, the not very lamented president, I will admit, saying, we will break the back of the energy crisis. We will lay the foundation for our future capacity to meet America's energy needs from America's own resources. He started Project Independence, which famously concluded that energy independence would not accomplish very much in terms of our geopolitical situation, and it would be hugely expensive. Not a whole lot has changed. And then there's who should we emulate? Thomas Friedman, the noted pundit and New York Times columnist, says Chinese decision to go green is the 21st century equivalent of the Soviet Union's 1957 launch of Sputnik. Well, Sputnik just went up again. China's going clean tech. Obviously, if China's doing it, we should do it. But this reminds me of Nikita Khrushchev, whose memoirs, he talks about the fact that when he met with President Eisenhower said, "My military always says to me, we should fund this. Why? Because the Soviet Union is doing it. Therefore, we should do it." This is not a good rationale for doing a policy. It certainly doesn't substitute for good analysis of any given policy. And I will point out that the Chinese have done a lot of things that we should not emulate. Similarly, people have argued for example, the supersonic transport because the Europeans were doing it, or the fast breeder reactor because Japan and others were doing it. And both turned out to be flawed technology. Vehicle efficiency. Yes, people say we need to do things like the smart car. Why? Because it's much more efficient. Of course, the same was true of the oxen, which was about 30% more food efficient than horses. You didn't see a lot of people trotting around on oxen in those days, certainly not in the upper classes, and the cities were not, generally speaking, full of oxen. And just as people in the 19th century preferred horses over oxen, so a lot of people don't want a small fuel-efficient car, or maybe they like to take one and modify it a little bit to feel a little more masculine. The thing that always amuses me is the political correctness, which sometimes seems to be inverted depending on where you are. Here we have an environmentally friendly solution to urban transport, the pedicab. Someone pedals you around town. Of course, it used to be that this was considered imperialist exploitation of the natives. I don't know if the man pulling the carriage there is smiling from happiness or grimacing in pain. But the man reclining in the carriage looks quite happy. People power. Some things don't change. Yes, we could very well rely on our own 2 feet, with or without wheels and pedals. The reason we don't is it's not terribly efficient, even though it's actually a pretty old technology. This goes back, well, you could either say this goes back to the 60s and the cartoon, or I suppose if you were a bit of a visionary, you could think that maybe this is Amory Lovin's great ancestor from 3,000 years ago with his own version of the hypercar. Another argument that is frequently heard these days is that costs of production are permanently high, yet there are many reasons to doubt that, not least of which is the fact that in 1985 you had almost the identical attitude that prices would soon recover, that prices were not affecting demand, that non-OPEC has peaked, but especially that costs were so high that prices had to go up. This is a quote from the OECD Observer, October 1985. You will note that the costs are not in dollars per barrel, but capital costs, although they would translate into something around $50 to $70 per barrel at a time when the actual price was about $28 a barrel. So obviously that explains why people thought that the costs were so high that prices had to quote-unquote recover instead of collapsing as they did shortly thereafter. And many people have noticed that non-OPEC supply has performed poorly, especially if you leave out the former Soviet Union. But it's not the first time. You can see that we've had several periods of flatness, and we're seeing a lot of recovery recently, primarily due to shale oil production in the U.S., although there's certainly other areas from Canada to Colombia that have shown growth. And no doubt people will say, well, if it wasn't for shale, yeah, but as the American philosopher Rosanna used to say, it's always something. So we wind up with views of two different philosophers, very disparate. Jim Morrison, who said the future's uncertain and the end is always near, which we've certainly heard a lot the last decade. Or George Santayana, who said those who do not learn from history are doomed to repeat it. I would suggest that a little attention to history will help you realize that most of the problems the industry is facing now are not novel, and certainly not a suggestion that the peak in oil production, or for that matter, oil demand, is near. Thank you very much.